Welcome to Ferment Radio. I'm your host Aga Pokrivka, and my guest today is Tara Whitsitt. Tara is a nomadic artist and educator whose passion for growing food and teaching fermentation inspired the grassroots educational project Fermentation on Wheels. Tara has been driving across the USA for over 7 years, sharing starter cultures, the history and science of fermentation, as well as countless stories that she has gathered on the road. Together with millions of microbes, she is now rooted in the Kittatinny Valley, New Jersey. Hello, Tara. Could you tell us about yourself?
My name is Tara Whitsitt, and I am based in Northwest New Jersey. So it's a rather rural part of New Jersey, but I'm also close to New York City. And before this, I was traveling with my project, Fermentation on Wheels. I traveled for about 6 years, and I started out on the west coast of the United States, where I had been living. And Fermentation on Wheels is a social art project. So I took a old military bus and I turned it into a fermentation lab. It's also a workshop space and a fermentation library. And I drove it around the country, specifically teaching fermentation, sharing fermented foods, and also providing a space for, all kinds of conversations surrounding fermentation. So, I also, in my travels, it was very important to me that everyone had access to this work. So, in all of my travels, every workshop I did was donation based. Pay what you can. And I also had a very large collection of starter cultures. So like sourdough starter, kombucha, water kefir grains, vinegar mothers, that I would share and sell to people attending workshops. Accessibility was a really important part of this project from the beginning. And then also the creativity, bringing some level of so fermentation is this very versatile practice. And I think that a lot of people approach it thinking, oh, this is like a science that I need to understand. It's not exactly necessary to understand that to produce something delicious and nutritious, very beautiful. Like the entire process is extremely mesmerizing, and I've always just seen it as such an incredible art form. I actually come from a family that's very deep in the sciences.
This is exactly what I wanted to ask. What brought you to fermentation in the first place?
So it was not my family life for sure. And actually, my family, given that they are scientists or wrapped up in the sciences in one way or another, they are actually more afraid to eat fermented foods than not afraid. So, that science doesn't actually it doesn't directly connect to fermentation. I feel like fermentation is so much of being in your heart and really becoming the food. If you're a specialist in the sciences, that's kind of that is the realm you understand of science is you can either get something good or something bad. Whereas with fermentation, that's not necessarily the case. There's a lot of gray area.
It's quite intuitive too, because I guess that's this question when fermented food is actually fermented and when it's get bad. I usually answer this question use your intuition. If you smell something and it smells yummy for you, then probably it's something which can be eaten actually. So there is this intuitive part to it.
Yes, it's very intuitive. It's very much, relying on your senses. no one like knew the scientific process of fermentation when they were first doing this stuff. It was all just through this like experimentation and like the like a kind of like fearlessness to just like figure out what was tasty, what wasn't, like what worked. I mean, there was no like way to test these foods when people were first fermenting.
Yeah, and like if we think of it that we would trust more a label on the food product more than our own senses, this is also a little bit strange, actually, when we think about it more.
It is totally strange. It's totally strange. I mean, it's really like buying into that like capitalist system, right? Where you're like consuming what someone tells you to consume rather than trusting yourself as far as what you should be consuming. And so like I feel that fermentation is also very liberating. It's very empowering for humans. It's really like taking control of your food. Um, I was first introduced to fermentation in uh it was 2011 when I was living in New York City, and I met someone at my local farmers market who wanted to introduce me to fermentation in one way or another, and we decided to make sauerkraut together. And it was a very revelatory moment for me, like making sauerkraut, at least like, the weeks that followed, or the week that followed, even the days that followed, because we made this sauerkraut. We made it with green and red cabbage, chopped it, salted it, put it in a jar, pushed it below the brine, and then I kept that in my kitchen. And I just watched it, and I mean, it was very mesmerizing, and it's like transformation of like the colors were changing, and I could see like bubbles rising up. But it also made me realize how little I knew about all of the hidden life forces surrounding us, and like how that plays into our lives. And I think I also realized in that moment, like my disconnection from like the greater arena of life. And that really motivated me to explore uh, soil and more rural areas, and just, like really get out of my comfort zone. Go someplace where life was very, very abundant. And I moved to Oregon, to a little commune in the woods on the coast of Oregon, like very far away from everything, no internet access. I moved into a yurt. And then I learned how to garden, and I fermented nonstop. I guess like for me, that time was to really like break free of the chains of urban life, to like learn another way of living that didn't feel so dependent on the system of the city. It taught me a lot about self-sufficiency too, which I think, fermentation, I mean, God, metaphors abound in fermentation. And like self-sufficiency is a really big one. I am involved in fermentation as an activist, and like the philosophy of it and how it like ties into my life values. I very much like got into this work because I care about social justice. We're experiencing a lot of upheaval right now in our system, and it's been going on for a long time, but we are at a breaking point. And I do know that like coronavirus has amplified what's going on right now, with Black Lives Matter. And it's it's just been really inspiring and heartening to watch the way everything is unfolding as far as like, people really showing up. And I'm I'm feeling really grateful for that. So, and I'm also excited to like be involved and help make that change and use my platform for that reason. And yeah, I think that, fermentation is also, it is this really great metaphor of how like all people are inextricably linked. Like we are all one as well. We're like part of this greater collective and we are weaker on our own. And all of these ancient food practices, they're all borrowed, like we didn't, I mean, as someone speaking as like, from like white privilege in America who is like, not native to these lands, um my culture is completely like a concoction of lots of different cultures that came way before my time and my parents' time. And, it's really important for that to be acknowledged in our food system. And so, yeah, I feel like that's another reason why I'm like feeling really excited and interested doing research of how I can use my platform to support this work.
I'm happy that you mentioned this whole like a huge and very important topic, because I also feel this relevance of fermentation as a practice, but also as a metaphor. You've mentioned that you would like to use your platform or your work to contribute to like a positive change. Could you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so I think since I work in education primarily and I'm an artist. So a lot of my art, I mean, all of my art centers around um, fermentation, whether it's like presenting recipes or sharing personal stories of work in fermentation. Sometimes they're just um, art pieces and something beautiful, and it helps illustrate something in the fermentation world or the food world that ties into um, these practices of transformation. And lately the work I've been very focused on, it's called Fermentation Illustrated, and it's a monthly zine series that I release. So a zine is an independently published magazine, usually a much shorter format than your typical magazine. And these zines I ship out all over the world, and especially all over the United States. I always focus on a theme for each magazine. So, for example, my last zine, it was called The China Issue, and it was all about methods of Chinese fermentation. So I went to China a few years ago. I guess it was a year and a half ago now, and I taught fermentation and I traveled a lot and I learned quite a bit. I definitely want my next zine to focus in on issues related to this revolutionary time, how we can engage ourselves, but specifically how we can engage ourselves with food too, and also like honor where certain foods come from. And I guess like my plan for this next issue is actually focusing in on wild foods, which when I say wild, I mean like foods that are native to the land. So that have been, that have grown here always. And I mean, especially like indigenous people who unfortunately have been, you know, mass murdered from a very early place in time. However, they still exist, they're around, but their numbers have just been decreased so terribly. And I think that like bringing light to these food traditions that are native to the Americas, especially in the United States of America, and pointing that out. And then I'm also wanting to do a lot of research into like Black American food traditions, the folks who first came here, how they farmed, especially once they were gaining more freedoms and practicing their own traditions. And so, like, yeah, it still requires a lot of research, but I do want to use my platform as someone who works in food and fermentation to, show those processes and really, like, give space.
From a practical point of view, actually, I'm very curious how did you accustom this bass, and how was it to be on the road with the basically jars and other containers with fermented food? Because I can imagine that kind of shaky environment also introduces some other element to fermentation when you are on the road. What were your experiences of that, and what are your kind of learnings from it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, agitation, I mean, like most ferments, they have kind of like their own specific needs. And so some of these ferments are going to be happier with agitation and others are not going to be as happy. But yeah, I feel like, I mean, so agitation also helps with aeration, right? And that can be good for like wines and beers. It prevents like this yeast layer of growing on top. But then, like for kombucha and vinegar, I mean, it can be very difficult to grow a proper SCOBY. I mean, things are still fermenting, but if you're moving fast, then your SCOBY will just, it will very quickly not be destroyed, but it will never mature into into a nice full mother. So, there's that. But I mean, I wouldn't say that I had huge challenges with my ferments while on the road. It's extremely secure. Like I have this station I built, and it's made with birch wood, and it's like 2 tiers. And the first tier holds all of my carboys in gallon jugs. So anything that is, it's mostly like aging vinegars and wines and beers. And then the top tier is all for vegetable fermentation and starter cultures. I have kombucha and, it's like mostly gallon jugs, but I have the capacity for 40 to 50 gallons of fermented foods at any given time. And then the top of that station is just this really nice piece of maple wood that, it's my kitchen counter. So one of my kitchen counters. So my bus is built out as a home too. So I'm in my bus right now. I live in my bus. It's been stationary.
That's great.
Yeah, it's been stationary for 1 year. I am living in a place where I have access to large gardens, and that's kind of been what I was looking for. And I also wanted to be back on the East Coast, close enough to urban life where I feel like I can make impact in urban lives, but far enough to where I can grow my own food and, just have space to like be in nature. And yeah, experience the natural order of things, which I very much think is like, that is fermentation. Like I live my life, like I am like acknowledging that life is one big fermentation project, and I want to be close to that. So I do feel like that requires um being outdoors, working with plants, being with the life cycle of everything and in a natural environment. Like that's important to me. So, but anyway, so I'm stationary right now. And before I moved, so during my busy season, that would be like spring, summer, fall. Um, I would teach, say, 3 to 5 classes a week, and I'd go to different community centers, farms. I worked with a lot of different nonprofits. I also did work in public school systems, working with kids. Um, and yeah, I would drive my bus to where I was going, and then people would come in. And that's when I'm moving the fastest. But um, even given that, it's not like I would drive from Texas to New York in a week. Like that wouldn't be possible. It's like I would be in Texas for like a month, going to every city I could.
Many stops.
Many stops. Yeah, I mean, like I would really concentrate my time in a place to make to reach the most people. So yeah, and it's also like, this is a slow moving vehicle too. There's a lot of logistics that go into making all of it work. And I love it, but I think there's also a time to like sit back and plan. And really my goal in the future, what I'm planning for, is to get a shorter vehicle that will be my fermentation space. And I haven't found the vehicle yet, but it's like one of these things. I'm looking for the perfect vehicle, and it will either be like a short bus or maybe a vintage van, and then that will be my fermentation vehicle. So a lot of the elements in here that I live with, it will go into that space, and then I can travel with that. And the beauty of that is really it's going to be much more efficient as far as like fuel is concerned. So my current bus, it's 40 feet long, which in the metric system, I'm not sure exactly what that translates to, but it's very big. It's a huge bus. And like I said, it is my living space. Like I have my bed in the back, and I have a composting toilet that I built, and I've put plumbing in it, and I have a wood burning stove and my refrigerator and a solar panels on top. Like I have put a lot of work into this bus to make it a space that I can live in.
Yeah, it's amazing. Actually, I just checked. It's 12 meters, so it's a big machine.
Yes. Yeah. It is very big. And it's very tall. It's taller than the average bus. I mentioned earlier it's an old military bus. And so when I say military bus, it was used by the Michigan police. It originated in Michigan, and then a couple bought it at an auction, drove it to Oregon. And when I was in Oregon, after I had spent this time at the commune fermenting and just doing a lot of self-study and fermentation, I was like really at this point of like, what am I going to do with this? And like, how am I going to do it to where I'm not like, I didn't want a commercial business. I didn't want this like standard way of being in the fermentation world. And I really wanted to integrate art into it in some way. And this idea popped up.
So you're still planning to come back on the road, basically, when the bus will be found and when the situation will allow.
Eventually, yeah, I definitely want to do that. And I think that, right now I'm like in this moment of having to do a lot of fundraising, which I haven't I have not launched a campaign for fundraising yet. I feel like it's been so important to me that I invest my time in Fermentation Illustrated and really like really rooting myself in a community here on the East Coast so that I know I have a home to come back to. Because yeah, I think like even when we travel and as we're growing up, getting older, like you want to feel a connection to a place. And yeah, to like have that space where you can always go back and you feel like completely yourself, completely at home. Like you have a community who will, support you and you will support them. And it's just like having that level of intimacy with a place. That's really important to me. And I definitely have that level of intimacy with Eugene, Oregon, where I lived for years and where I purchased my bus.
Okay. So it's a piece of home traveling with you, or it was traveling with you.
Yeah, and I have a big community there, and I do visit them when I can. But I feel much more drawn to the East Coast as far as my professional work goes. I feel like there's so much work to do on the East Coast. And I want to be, this is where I want to be. This is where I want to be working. And so I am planning to go back on the road. However, I want to establish myself in, a space where I feel rooted first. And I do need to raise money to get that work going because I definitely want to approach it in the same way I did with the original bus that I drove around in my bus where I'm, like I said, where I'm living now, where uh, everything is very accessible. I want to continue doing donation based work when I'm traveling. That's always going to be important to me. And
And
so,
in your project, because it sounds like a extremely actually big and kind of complex project, because I can imagine that there is this fermentation part, but then there is also the maintenance of a vehicle and transforming it to what it became, and then also like a logistics of how to organize the travel and maybe the places where you've been performing the workshops. Is it all the work you've done yourself, or you had also group of people helping with that?
it was mostly me. I mean, of course, over the years, I've met so many people who have like taught me a lot and especially like building out the bus. I've got to say, like, I met a lot of really interesting people who, when they saw certain parts of my bus, like, for example, there's this man who drives around the country, his name is Giuseppe Spadafora, and he has a bus called Free Tea Party, and he drives around serving free tea. And he is a complete genius when it comes to like building very efficient systems, and he taught me so much about how to install a more efficient solar system. Like I had my solar panels for a long time, and I definitely had things wired up rather nicely, but I couldn't take it to the next level until I met him and learned a lot from him. So, there's that. And like just like he's just filled with so much great information, and I feel like I learned a lot.
I think it's maybe a little bit like in fermentation itself, like kind of all knowledge and all the ingredients are out there. Like there is no reason to reinvent things which are out there. You just need to kind of go for it.
Right. Yeah. Definitely. I mean, so much of what we do in the world, it's like imitating what's already been done. I mean, we put our own twist on it, but, like most things have already existed. They just exist in a different like time and plane and format.
I'm even more now excited to experience that in person. So I hope that one day I will be able to catch you somewhere on the road.
I hope so too. Thank you.